Not long ago, I compared the Intel Pentium G4400 and AMD Athlon X4 860K in an effort to determine which budget CPU gamers should purchase. Both cost well under $100, and the G4400, which is my preferred choice for gamers, features 2 Skylake cores and a whopping 3MB L3 cache, which is especially whopping when compared to the 860K's complete lack of an L3 cache at all. The G4400 isn't a bad budget processor, but what if I told you for about the same money you could be rocking an octa-core processor based on a fairly modern CPU architecture with a truly massive 20MB L3 cache, huh? What if I told you that? Well, it's true, and there aren't really any strings attached. The processor in question is the Xeon E5-2670, a server-grade processor that just 4 years ago was retailing for $1,550 US. Today it can be had for just 5% of the original retail price, and I picked mine up on eBay for just $75 US, which works out to only be $125 Australian, including shipping from the States. Dirt cheap, right? For that money, you get an 8-core, 16-thread, 32nm Sandy Bridge EP processor clocked at 2.6 GHz with a 3.3 GHz maximum turbo frequency. As this is a Xeon processor, it can also support ECC memory, along with standard DDR3 memory clocked up to 1600 MHz, running in quad-channel config. The only other piece of the equation is an Intel X79 motherboard, which can be also purchased online for a fair price. Expect to pay just under $200 US or a little less than $300 Australian. In comparison, the Core i7-4960X boasts just 6 cores, though they are clocked higher at 3.6 GHz. The 4960X also has a smaller 15MB L3 cache, though it can support slightly faster DDR3 1866 memory. What's most important to note here is that the 4960X began selling in late 2013 for around $1,000, and today you can still expect to pay that same ridiculous figure for one. Those wanting an Intel 8-core processor in their desktop system are limited to the Core i7-5960X. And while it's a very impressive CPU, it comes to the tune of $1,050 US, or a wallet-melting 1,600 Australian. Spec-wise, the Core i7-5960X and Xeon E5-2670 are actually quite similar on paper, with the only significant difference being the change in CPU architecture from Sandy Bridge to Haswell. I'm not suggesting the E5-2670 will be faster or even as fast as the 5960X, but I don't expect it to be much slower either. And given the extreme price difference, that's really something. Obviously an 8-core processor is going to crush the Pentium G4400, but what about the much more expensive Core i5-6600K and i7-6700K processors? Let's go to the benchmark lab and find out. The memory bandwidth performance of the E5-2670 is greater than that of the Core i7-6700K and Core i5-6600K processors at 39GB per second. The R1 cache performance, however, is quite a bit slower, as the Xeon processor is based on a 2-generation-old architecture now. The 3DPM benchmark runs through 6 algorithms for a specified number of particles and steps, and calculates the speed of each algorithm, then sums them all for a final score. For single-threaded tasks, the E5-2670 is going to lag behind higher clock processors such as the 6600K and 6700K, though it's still faster than the FX8370. The multi-threaded performance, on the other hand, is very impressive, placing the E5-2670 smack bang in the middle of the 5960X and 6700K. The synthetic Cinebench R15 is a popular benchmark for measuring raw CPU performance, both single and multi-threaded. This time we see the E5-2670 is closer to the 6700K than the 5960X in performance, but it crushed the FX8370 and Core i5-6600K. If compression is your game, then take note, as the E5-2670 isn't a great deal slower than the 5960X. It is, however, worlds faster than the 6700K, providing 60% more performance in the multi-threaded test. Those of you into complex spreadsheets will love what the E5-2670 has to offer. It completed the famous Monte Carlo workload in just 2.9 seconds, which again placed it between the 5960X and the 6700K, both of which are obviously very fast desktop processors. Not into Excel? Maybe Photoshop CC is more your jam. If so, the E5-2670 will also impress here, as it completed the workload in just 13.4 seconds, once again placing it between the 6700K and the 5960X. The X264HD benchmark measures encoding performance, and here we see that although the E5-2670 is quite a bit slower than the 5960X, it does manage to outcompete the 6700K, while it wipes the floor with the Core i5-6600K and FX8370. It wouldn't be right if I didn't include some gaming benchmarks, so here they are, and first up we have The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. In the CPU-intensive town of Novigrad, we see that the E5-2670 hangs in there with the 5960X, making it slightly faster than the FX8370. The lower clock speed of the E5-2670 does hurt it a little bit in Just Cause 3, though considering we're testing with a GeForce GTX 980 Ti, the performance is still very good, certainly much better than the FX8370. The E5-2670 can again be found lagging behind the desktop processors, this time in Grand Theft Auto 5. Still, for such an affordable processor, a minimum of 80 FPS is nothing to sneeze at. The Boston section of Fallout 4 seems to suffer from a coding bottleneck, if that is a thing. In our tests using the latest version of the game, just 30% of the E5-2670 was being utilised, and while all threads were being actively used, none were being maxed out. These results were included because the game is hugely popular, but they should probably be taken with a grain of salt. Finally, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 3, and here the E5-2670 performed very well, getting the most out of the GeForce GTX 980 Ti graphics card. With an average of 123 FPS, the E5-2670 was faster than the Core i5-6600K, and much faster than the FX8370. This video came about after watching a Tech Gaming Weekly livestream where Brian from Tech Yes City talked about the insane bargain that is the Xeon E5-2670. When it comes to secondhand deals, Brian is the man, so I jumped on eBay and quickly pulled the trigger. After landing the processor for 125 Australian, I've since grabbed a second for even less at $110, and plan to eventually throw them together on a dual socket server board for some SMP 16 core action. Honestly, if I was looking at building a new computer today, I'd be very tempted by a second-hand Xeon E5-2670 and an accompanying X79 motherboard. The combo can be had for around $250 from reputable sellers on eBay, and with that you just need to add some DDR3 memory and you're away. Just make sure you don't buy an engineering sample, and don't be confused by the Xeon E5-2670 V2, which is a 10-core version that costs around 6 times more. In comparison, the FX8370 system that we tested would cost you around the same figure if you opt for a low-end AMD 970 motherboard, the difference being that you get considerably more performance out of the second-hand Xeon setup, including 75% more performance in applications such as Photoshop CC and 100% more in WinRAR. Gamers also stand to benefit from the Xeon E5-2670 as it crushed the FX8370 in all tests, and realistically it wasn't a great deal slower than the Core i5-6600K, a CPU that'll set you back $250 alone. Applications and games that take advantage of all 8 cores will see the E5-2670 land pretty much right between the Core i7-6700K and 5960X, which for a $75 processor is obviously a serious deal. The only other drawback to the E5-2670, other than its limited and locked clock speed, is the X79 chipset. The X79 was barely an upgrade from the X58 chipset that came 3 years before it. Essentially, you got 2 extra USB ports, 2 additional PCIe x 1 lanes, and a pair of SATA 6GB per second port upgrades. Still, the X79's feature set might not impress, but it does include all of the essentials, and more modern hardware such as M2 NVMe SSDs can be added using a PCI Express adapter card. The ASRock X79 Extreme 6 that I bought for testing worked very well, and I'm still playing around with the overclocking, as limited as it may be. So far with a 107MHz base clock, I've only been able to extract around 10% more performance, so nothing to write home about. It's also worth mentioning that the Xeon E5-2670 is a 115W processor that would seem to generate a similar amount of heat as a 140W 5960X, so a decent cooler is in order. So what are you waiting for? Go get yourself a 16-threaded Xeon for the price of a modern budget processor.
Do it now!